The good news of clinical trial transparency is that as a community, we've got a very clear goal, which is also being set out by the World Health Organization. We want the results of all interventional clinical trials. We want them on trial registries, and we want them within 12 months of trial completion. And in Europe alone, there are now about 20 groups that are actively campaigning on this. And we've achieved remarkable progress if you compare the status quo to 10 years ago. I mean, Big Pharma was legally compliant already when I started 4 years ago. It's a massive achievement by industry. And in recent months, big academia has been catching up. So if you look at the chart below, you've got the publication of clinical trial results on the European Trial Registry by the 30 top universities and hospitals in Europe. Up to March 2019, they'd uploaded only 162 results. Since then, they've uploaded nearly 300 results. So the majority of the top hospitals and universities in Europe are already working to fix this. The few that aren't working to fix this, I'm confident they'll be working to fix this within a year. And this has really worked. You know, the campaigning has worked. I mean, when you look at Big Pharma becoming legally compliant, if you told people 10 years ago that that would happen, they would have said, oh, no, never, you know. And now with big academia, it's also working. But I think the key words here are big and legal compliance. So if we're campaigning for big players to follow laws and regulations, we can be incredibly successful. What are the gaps in legal compliance that we're still facing today? In Europe, there's over 4,000 clinical trials missing results that should have their results out there. In the United States, it's over 2,000 trials missing results. And, you know, we always throw about these figures, but think about how many patients are behind each trial. Think about how many dollars are behind each trial. This is a huge amount of medical research waste. So who's not reporting their results? Well, as I said, Big Pharma is doing incredibly well. In Europe, 94% of the results by Big Pharma that should be up there are up there. When you go to small pharma, it's only 40% of results. And when you go to academia, big and small, it's only 26% of results. So those are the players of greatest concern. When we look at the breakdown of the US portfolio, very similar. Big pharma doing incredibly well. Academia, so-so. Bigger institutions do better than institutions in academia as well. And then compliance for small pharma in the United States is very weak. And the important thing to note is that campaigning, as we've been done it so far, simply won't work there. We can't write letters to 500 small companies and 500 universities. These are not companies or universities in the public eye. There's no media interest in this really. All we get on these players are aggregate statistics, but we can't engage with them directly. We don't have the funding to do that. We don't have the resources. And stepping back, let's look at the clinical trial landscape. What we've been talking about so far is exclusively, or pretty much exclusively, drug trials, which are very tightly regulated, where there are clear legal and regulatory disclosure requirements. When we move on to medical device trials, the picture gets really different. Yes, in the US, for some medical device trials, there are disclosure requirements. In the European Union, the rules are really lax, essentially very little transparency rule. And then when we talk about all other clinical trials, say, of surgery, of physiotherapy, of behavioral interventions, in most jurisdictions, there are no transparency requirements whatsoever. So the successes that we've been celebrating are the very tip of the medical evidence iceberg only. And it's brilliant that we got the results out there. It's brilliant that we've managed to convince big pharma and big academia to finally tackle this problem. But on the whole rest of the medical evidence space, campaigning as usual is simply not going to work. Part of the reason is technical. For example, in Germany, medical device trials are scattered across 3 different clinical trial registries. I don't see anyone ever building a trials tracker for medical device trials. We simply don't have a simple overview of the landscape. We can't find out at the click of a button how different institutions are doing. Business as usual, campaigning as usual is not going to work. So how do we move on from here? I think the key to ending medical research waste, rather than just reducing medical research waste, which is what we've been doing so far, is with the gatekeepers. Those are the institutions that have the power to give a green light or a red light to trials. And there are 3 key gatekeepers. One of them is ethics committees. Every trial has to get approval from an ethics committee before it can proceed. The second one are trial funders. They're not relevant to industry so much, but if a funder refuses to give a hospital or a university money to run a trial, those institutions simply can't run trials. So funders are incredibly powerful in this landscape. And the final one is medicines regulators. So we have these laws on the books, but so far those laws aren't being effectively enforced. So I'm super excited that today we've got 3 amazing speakers who will tell us how these players can actually work to end research waste based on their personal experience and on the fantastic work that they themselves have been doing. So the first one is Naho Yamazaki from the UK Health Research Authority, who was involved in drawing up the UK National Clinical Trial Transparency Strategy. As far as I'm aware, it's the only strategy of its kind in the world, and the aim is to get the results of all clinical trials reported. And if this strategy works out as planned, the UK will be the first country worldwide where no clinical trial remains unreported, maybe 2-3 years from now. This is really radical, and I wish we'd see that in other countries too. The second speaker is Rachel Knowles from the Medical Research Council. And the Medical Research Council in the UK has always been really serious about clinical trial transparency. And now they've started monitoring whether their grantees register their trials and report their trials. So if you ask the MRC today, which trials did you fund last year and have they all reported their results, they can immediately give you an answer. The process wasn't easy. She'll talk us through that, but again, it's a fantastic innovation. And then finally, medical regulators in national EU member states have got a sort of very mixed performance in enforcing the transparency rules out there and also in supporting compliance. So we'll be hearing from Michael Wolzt from Medical University Vienna. The Austrian national regulator helped his university to become one of the universities in Europe that is now uploading clinical trial results at record speed. Okay, so over to you, Naho.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, great. So thank you for the opportunity to talk today. I'd like to talk to you about Make It Public, our strategy for research transparency. Next slide, please. So, I'm the head of policy and engagement at the Health Research Authority. And for those of you who are not familiar with the HRA, I thought I'll start with a little bit of what we do. The vision of the authority is for high quality health and social care research that improves people's health and well-being. And our focus is on research being ethical, legal, and open and transparent, and also done in partnership. So I'll just go through each of those. In terms of the ethics, we publish guidance on good practice in research, and we provide research ethics review of all new studies. That's about 6,000 studies a year through our 64 research ethics committee that we support. In terms of lawful, we're not the only ones doing legal checks, obviously, but we carry out these checks on behalf of the NHS in England, speeding up the approvals process and removing duplication. We also want research to be open and transparent. That's what I'll be talking about today. But just as a kind of final point, we work to ensure that ethical research is done in partnership with patients and the public. And to help achieve that, we set clear expectations, provide advice, and make the case for the value of public involvement. Next slide, please. So I don't think I need to speak to this audience about the importance of transparency, but it really reduces waste and informs decision making and builds trust and participation. So that's the kind of the core reason for why we're doing this. And when we talk about transparency, we mean registering research, reporting results, and informing participants, and enabling the sharing of study data and tissue for further research, which is the fourth pillar, which is not shown here at the moment on the slides. And this data that we complied earlier in 2019 is indicative of the issues, which you're probably all familiar with. So only 70% of clinical trials registered on the WHO recognized registry, and 75% of clinical trials of medicines that don't report results to a registry on time, with rates of other studies even lower. And despite saying they will, the majority of clinical trials don't inform participants about the results. So participants generally feel short-charged from their participation in clinical trials. Next slide, please. So in 2019, we embarked on developing a strategy to change the current practices. And that's when we started the Make It Public consultation. Next slide, please. You might need to move through the, thank you. So these are the elements of the consultation, which ran from June to September last year. So there were a range of things, from online survey to workshops, webinars, and of a variety of individuals. We tried to get the views of these wide range of stakeholders in order to get input into what we should do, and particularly sort of bearing in mind the accessibility, feasibility, and impact on what we were proposing, to build support and identify areas for collaboration, and to also notify the community of our intent. So it was a really way of saying that this is what's coming. And we were really pleased with the responses that we got and the kind of level of engagement. So for instance, through the online survey, we had 36% of patients and patient advocates and research participants responding. And in terms of the workshops, again, a quarter of those were from the patient advocate and research participant groups. So that was really heartening. Next slide, please. Yeah, that's it. So the upshot of the consultation was that there was overall support for the strategy, the draft strategy that we put forward in the consultation, and the proposed changes. And people were happy for us to initially focus on clinical trials, although many felt that that should be extended to all health and social care research in the future. And our proposal that we initially focus on registration, reporting of results, and informing participants, and park the fourth pillar of data and tissue sharing, because they agree that there are plenty of people working in this arena already. Right, so next slide, please. So what's actually in the strategy, and I'll just go through this briefly now. Our vision is really quite straightforward. It's that trusted information about health and social care research studies is publicly available for the benefit of all. And in order to promote that, we have proposed 3 elements in our strategy, which is to make transparency easy, make transparency the norm, and make information public. And we've set out 10 commitments and a plan for how we'll deliver that. So in terms of making it easy, these relate to provision of clear guidance and really clarifying our expectations, and easy to use research approval system. So we have a centralized approval IT platform platform. And we really want to make that a lot more user-friendly so that people can track the entire research sort of journey through that platform, and then upload information about their transparency, meeting their transparency requirements more easily, and also to send reminders when those requirements, compliance with those requirements are due. In terms of making transparency the norm, we pledge to work with the others to align expectation, but also to really celebrate success where they're good practice, as well as sort of highlighting poor performance and then taking action where necessary. So this is all a strand around sort of really instituting culture change. And finally, on making information public. We want to ensure that all clinical trials are registered, as Till mentioned earlier, and making information about studies available through various means, working in partnership with others working in this area. So next slide, please. So these are the things we have planned in implementing the strategy. The first one is about reviewing and updating our guidance that we have, and also the text that we have in standard conditions, so that people are much clearer about what they're expected to do. But also we'll support that with developing learning modules around this. The second one is about modernizing this site on our website that provides summary of individual study information. So at the moment, all studies that are approved by our ethics committee are uploaded onto our website 3 months after the approval generally. And for recently, for COVID-19 studies, that research studies that we've been fast tracking for approval, we have been uploading this information 3 days after the approval process. So that we already have a bit of a repository of information of the studies that we approve, but we really want to enhance what we have there, because the data on there is a bit patchy at the moment and it's not always up to date. Eventually, we want to add information about people's research transparency performance as part of that, data set.
Do it properly.
Okay, and then the third aspect is an engagement program. So we want to publish annual reports around this and highlighting people's performance, but recognizing that in the first instance it's more likely to be about our work and best practice examples. The fourth aspect is about establishing ongoing monitoring on study reporting and developing a framework for measuring the performance. So at the moment, we ask people to submit final reports to the HRA, but we don't closely monitor this, and the data set is, there's no standard data set, so the information received is patchy. We're going to develop a standard set of data in relation to meeting transparency requirements, and using that data, we'll start tracking performance. The fifth element is doing out an options appraisal to around registration. So we make a commitment in the strategy that we will register all clinical trials on behalf of sponsors and researchers in the future. We're just trying to work out what the best mechanism of doing that is. I talked about aligning expectations across funders and regulators. So we are looking to establish a stakeholder group around this. And finally, we will introduce sanctions into the approvals process. This is a longer term goal because we need a proper monitoring and performance to be able to do this. But that's our ultimate sort of plan. Okay, so that's everything for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we're moving into Rachel.
Hello, thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me to talk today. So I'm the Medical Research Council Programme Manager for Clinical Research, which means I hand responsibility for our clinical trials policies. Next slide, please. So in this talk, what I'd like to do is just briefly introduce our clinical trials transparency policy, which we published in 2016. And then I'll also talk mainly about our compliance monitoring programme, which began in 2017, and also some of the ways in which we've been trying to increase compliance through, for example, raising awareness amongst researchers and actually implementing some sanctions. Next slide, please. So our policy was published in October 2016, and it covers clinical trials, clinical intervention studies, and public health intervention studies. So we require researchers to register their clinical trials in the ISRCTN registry within 12 months of being awarded funding. We require that the study protocol is made public, and this could be either a link or document in the registry entry, or it could be a published protocol. We require that there's public reporting of the main study findings, and that's done within 24 months of the award or trial end, whichever is later. And we encourage study data sets to be made available for sharing with other researchers. And so those are the 4 elements of our policy. Next slide, please. So in this slide, could you click again, please? So in this slide, this is a timeline. Yeah, and there's one more actually on this slide as well. Just thanks. So this is a timeline showing how far back we've gone in reviewing our clinical trials awards against the policy. So far, we're just auditing the clinical trials, but obviously in time, we would like to actually include all studies. So in 2017, this is the pinky purple line at the top there, we reviewed all trials that were awarded funding in the 5 years from February 2011 until January 2016. And then we also allowed a year, because obviously those latest trials will have needed a year to allow them time to register. So that bar at the top there represents the awards plus the time for registration that we allowed in the 2017 audit. Then in 2018, we audited 6 years of awards data, which is a blue bar, and in 2019, 7 years of awards data. And you can see that also what we did in the first year, we restricted ourselves to just looking at trials that were funded by our project grants. The year after, we included project grants and our global health trials. And in the last year, we actually included project grants, global trials, and some developmental clinical trials. So we feel now that we've identified the complete trials portfolio that we actually fund. So next slide, please. So what we found out from our monitoring. So the last monitoring audit that we did was in 2019, and that took in trials that were awarded between 2011 and 2018. We funded 216 clinical trials. 100% of these were registered. 53% of them were registered in the ISRCTN registry, which is actually the one that we require. So that's our preferred registry. And 90% of registrations in the last year of the audit were made prospectively. So that's something we hadn't looked at in detail in previous audits, but we were obviously interested in looking at more recently. And the graph just shows that actually our registration has been good, but we're still struggling to get people to register in the correct registry. So next slide, please. Yes, and one more click. Thanks very much. So this shows that this is the reporting. This represents the reporting of our main findings. So 97 clinical trials were completed during the period that we audited, and 92% of those had reported their findings. 35% of them reported their findings within 12 months, and that was up 8% from the previous audit in 2018, and 69% reported within 24 months. And that obviously was increased as well from the previous audit. So we are improving. And I think that's partly to do with the awareness raising that we're doing with clinicians and PIs that we fund. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this slide just shows you the timing of reporting. When we graphed out the timing or the time it took to report trials after they ended, we found that the majority were publishing or publicly reporting their results within 6 to 24 months of the end of the award or trial. And so we've set our policy to say that 24 months is the absolute limit, and that we expect all trials to have been reported within 24 months of the end of the trial. And that obviously means that we're not discouraging people from going through the peer review process and publishing their results, but at the same time, we're making sure that we're pulling everyone into this 24-month window. The trials that weren't reported at 24 months were either because they had negative results, there was early termination of the trial, or in some cases there was absence or a long period of leave of a key researcher. And whilst these are not acceptable reasons, they're things that we can work on because we now understand what the problems are. Next slide, please. So we also encourage trialists to share the child data set after the trial is complete. And we found in the last audit that of the 97 completed trials, 21 had being prepared as a data set for sharing, and 8% of these, all of the trials had shared data with other researchers. So we can see that over the previous audits, data sharing has been increasing, but it is quite slow, and it's something that we're obviously working on. Next slide, please. So this is the final slide. So first of all, I just want to really summarize the lessons that we've learned. And the first thing that we've learned is about identifying all the trials in our portfolio. And that was a big problem for us at the beginning because we didn't have a way of flagging. We've had to trawl through those 5 to 7 years to actually look and find the trials that we have. Next clip, please. So what we will be doing, or have been, yes, then there's one more, thanks. So what we are actually doing from 2020, we implemented a system of flagging of an award that included a trial at the start of the award, so that we will actually now be adding those incrementally to the portfolio. And hopefully that means that we'll also be able to do our audits in a more timely way and not perhaps wait quite so long to collect all that data. We're also identifying when the findings are reported. That was another problem for us. And we've been relying a lot on the ISRCTN registry, which proactively chases the publications and identifies which are the main results publications. So although we get annual reporting, it's not often that the researchers actually identify which is the main results publication. We can do that using the ISRCTN registry, and that's important for us. We also identified a lack of awareness by researchers of our policy requirements, but we're now contacting researchers during the audit to chase up those registrations and the lack of reporting. And that's also an opportunity to alert them to the audit, as is our annual monitoring when we start doing our annual monitoring every year. And finally, we have introduced sanctions for non-compliance this year. So we have sanctions for non-registration, which is to suspend funding until this is completed, and sanctions for non-reporting, and that is that any further awards will not start until the previous one has been reported. So these, we'll see how they go. We've just started that this year. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Michael?
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. Glad to be here. I'd like to report to you some of the efforts that we have successfully made and implemented in order to increase the number of clinical trials that were reported into the repositories. However, this did not happen at lightning speed, not even at rocket speed, as Till mentioned. It was a slow process. We started at a very, very low level. Reporting culture was rather poor, but we did our best to increase the reported trials, the numbers, and also come up with ideas and structural changes to facilitate the process that is in our university based on the shoulders of investigators. And the competent authorities in Austria, this is the Bundesamt für Sicherheit im Gesundheitswesen, they helped us a lot because they helped us to identify, as we already heard, the portfolio of trials, which is sometimes terribly difficult. Next slide, please. We have different sources of information regarding clinical trials. The investigators sometimes use different names for their clinical trials, for example, the English translation or the German to report. They even use unharmonized names for the clinical trial sponsor. They can use the English or the German. They can use abbreviations. It's in fact very difficult to identify the trials that are reportable. And the ethics committee, who have already started publishing the approved clinical trials in a sort of listing since 2009, came up with a comprehensive list of all different studies. But that included almost everything, even student theses. So it was a sort of database where we had at least comprehensive information, but not the one that we wanted to have. So we went to the competent authority in order to ask them whether they could help us with the UDRA-CT clinical trials database and filter those which have been initiated and submitted and received numbers by the Austrian authority. And so we, the database of the ethics committee was able to limit those to the clinical trials with medicines, with human medicines, so with drugs. And the competent authority checked those, rechecked, and also as representative in the clinical trial facilitators groups, made us aware of the limitations regarding the publications in UDRA-CT that was the limitation that phase 1 trials are usually not presented unless they are part of a pediatric investigation plan, and that some of the information is not made publicly available. That is the name of the investigator, for example. You can find this with some tricks and hints, but we went to our local hospital administration because based on our legal conditions, it's necessary to inform the hospital administration before you start a clinical trial, and you have to ask for their approval too. So they contain database and they maintain that and track investigators down. They also know changes in investigators and study coordinators and other material that is required. So from those different databases, we had a pretty comprehensive view of what is happening at the moment in time at our university and our university hospital. Next one, please. And the difficulty now was to institute a structure to match this information and to harmonize those so that we were able to identify the investigators and the current study coordinators upon whom we could attend to update the information. The line listing from the competent authority was matched with the ethics committee database and the review of uterus CT entries. And from that comprehensive summary, we contacted a person and identified those and asked them to update information. And that was done by help from the local clinical trials coordination center. Next one, please. And we published guidance documents and templates and took the advantage of the University Hospital Alliance Group together with Transparency to help us with tips and tricks of the trade, how those data fields should be entered with data. Those guidance documents were summarized, templates provided, the user assignment for the investigators was centralized with this help desk at the KKS Vienna, and this user entry identified the persons and substitute persons whom we contacted and delegated those tasks. But we didn't delegate it, we took them at hand. We gave them face-to-face meetings. We helped them with remote support, with WebEx meetings and others so that the data completion was rapid and swiftly done. Next one, please. Next slide. Yeah. There were still some trials hidden in the dark. That is those already mentioned from phase 1 drug trials. They're not being published results. We got the overview from the competent authority and from the hospital administration, and we also completed those. The databases are now complete. They are all entered into UJCT, but they are still not made public. The second point is clinical trials with devices are not captured. We do have data, we do have waste research, I still pointed out, but we don't have a single platform where we can enter those. That needs to be established, and the data entries should be structured and harmonized as much as possible. We should learn from UJCT what to do better. And almost the same applies to other biomedical research results. Some of those are not even prospective but retrospective, but even those trials can tell us a lot about clinical practice of biomedical fields, of comparative studies, of other research fields that form the basis of properly designed prospective clinical trials, and we also need to capture those in the future. So I think the keys of our success was the interaction with the competent authority. They were able to give us comprehensive lists of what really exists in the clinical trial database, and they helped us facilitate this process. The second was to install a single contact point, which had hands-on experience and where information material and the proper helping hand could be established. And the third success point was to track down the investigators and to keep their hand on that. And it needed to be a helping hand. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all our speakers. I'm stopping the slide share now, and I would appreciate if you turned on your cameras and kept your microphones off unless you're asking the question. So we have about 20-25 minutes for discussion, and as a chair, I'd like to take an opportunity to maybe ask the first question. The trend, the very positive trend is there. So it's fantastic that we've made this progress. However difficult it was, it took quite a lot of years for something extremely obvious. How, when you speak to people who are away from medicine, who are not connected to clinical trials, they can't even imagine that the results might not be published. They find it very scandalous, but the establishment, everyone from those who conduct the trials to those who fund those trials found it completely acceptable. And something as obvious as wearing seatbelts now requires an immense fight to get to where we need to be. So, and all of you talked about sanctions, and my question is, FDA imposes a sanction of fines, and that completely is being ignored and doesn't work, and no one ever collects those fines. I think very interesting Rachel's suggestion of withholding funding. Would that work? Because if, for example, one organization withholds funding, those unreporting trials can just go to the next funder. So what sanctions do you have in mind, and how can we make people compliant with it? Anyone, Naho or Michael or Rachel or Till?
So maybe I should start, because I raised the idea of sanctions. I mean, this is something that we obviously were not keen particularly to do, and we don't see it as an end in itself. But having spent quite a number of years now with the audit, raising awareness and encouraging, we did feel that we were at the point where when we contact people and say, well, you've not registered, we want to be able to say to them, until you register, we're going to suspend your funding. So it's not a really, you know, it's not a really big stick, but it just encourages people to actually go that step and register. And it's not a big deal for them to register. So, and obviously we're only suspending the funding until they do it. So something like that, it's kind of a small stick, but it's something that I think we just need that extra nudge nowadays. I don't think we're not at the moment certainly feeling that we have to do anything major in the ways of sanctions, and not to the extent I think that people would be put off actually coming to us as a funder, or I hope not, so at this stage.
If I may, a carrot and stick strategy is definitely something to consider. But on the other hand, if you remember the Medical Journal Editors Initiative, if you don't register a study beforehand, you're not going to get published. I mean, that was a very strong signal. But perhaps it shouldn't be as strict by funders, but in principle, I think you're right. It has to have consequences.
So, I mean, I talked about the sanction element as well, and this is something that we really need to work out quite carefully, because the last thing we want to deter is good quality research from happening. And what we are thinking about is considering past transparency performance as part of our ethics review process, or potentially the HRA approval process. So there are kind of two tracks that it could go down. And but then we need to think about details about, well, who do we apply the sanction against? Is it to the sponsor, or is it to the actual researcher who's bringing the application? I think this is the thing, you know, that there are lots of details that need to be worked out, but we have the intention of putting something in place to put that extra nudge, as Rachel mentioned.
I have a question about academic research. In the States, a lot of investigators seem to list their institution in that sponsor field on clinicaltrials.gov, making it a little bit easier to associate them with an institution. On UDRA-CT, I see that there's a great deal of research that is not associated with a university or institution, but a doctor, professor, so-and-so. And then if you Google them and do some LinkedIn research, you figure out, oh, they actually do work at the university in Vienna. Is there thought that institutional practices could be implemented to suggest that it's not just the professor's name, but the institution, that it sort of takes that approach, which makes it easier for groups to then manage that a little better within their organization?
Maybe I can answer that, Thomas. Thanks for asking. I think the new clinical trial regulation will put a hold on this, because you would need to register beforehand before you can apply to submit into the funnel system of the clinical trial application system. So that's going to end in a couple of months, basically. But still, we have a lot of studies under this old system where it's difficult, and I fully agree with you and wholeheartedly, it's difficult to track the investigators and therefore to put a screw on them.
So I'd like to just say that as part of the MRC's standard sort of annual engagement with research organisations, we do go out to the academic institutions, and one of the standard sort of bits of information that we convey to them is about our interest in clinical trials transparency, and the fact that we expect those research organisations that are receiving considerable amounts of funding from us for different researchers should actually be implementing policies that mean that they are actually supporting clinical trials transparency and registration. So it's something we push in different ways. And I mean, I don't know how successful it is, but we are continually raising awareness and trying to make sure that research organisations do take responsibility for this, that they don't see themselves as it being something that purely the researchers have to focus on.
Yeah, I'd like to second what Rachel just said, and I think if you look at strong institutions with strong systems and policies, they just ensure that all their researchers follow the rules. And I think it's inappropriate to sanction individuals. I think it's much more effective and efficient and appropriate to levy sanctions on institutions, because institutions can't say it's not our problem if trials conducted within our building are not being registered. You know, institutions really are responsible for that, and I think EU regulations reflect that, US legislation reflect that. It's really the sponsoring institution that's on the hook for this, not the individual.
Could I ask a question from the publisher side? So for either Rachel or Till or any of the speakers, the first thing I was going to ask is that I'm helping out a little bit with some manuscripts on an open access journal. And it occurred to me that sometimes, for example, I don't know if there's a standard checklist that publishers could have or should have, where if there's a protocol or a clinical trial submitted, if it had something at the top that said this has already been registered, or has it not been registered, could that be used as a mechanism to maybe slightly prioritise the peer review of those articles as a further incentive because they've done some good sort of, good practice and something like that. The other thing is that I think some researchers and some maybe peer reviewers as well are not as aware of the data extraction for unpublished data. And perhaps it might actually help if the journals were to liaise with the organisations we've seen today, perhaps slightly more than they are doing, because it could actually be a very valuable educational opportunity. Because I've seen instances where some referees on manuscripts comment that, oh, well, I'm not sure this protocol is worth publishing, and they're almost viewing the protocol as a clinical trial and not recognising that it's a prelude to a trial. So then there's a chance that some protocols might not get published, which would be a real shame. Because if there was an opportunity to improve them and implement that while the trial is ongoing, that could happen through protocols where sometimes maybe the standard or the bar is too high. I just wondered if you could make any comments, any of you, about the sort of publication role and whether there's something more that can be done there.
So I would say that one of the important things that you raised was about actually credit for the researchers or who have actually been doing all the things they should be doing. So have actually registered their studies, that are reporting in a timely way. And that so I think, I mean, it's an interesting idea to prioritise them for peer review. I'm not quite sure whether that works entirely. Yeah,
I think that was quite that was just a sort of wacky suggestion, but just as an idea of incentivization for, like you say, having ticked all the boxes in terms of good practice, it might be something that some may or may not consider.
Well, and I think it's something that we actually really need to think about sort of quite hard, because I mean, we almost need to have these wacky ideas and then work out whether there's anything that we can use, because I don't think we're as good as we could be at the moment in giving credit and incentivizing. So, you know, it's bad that we're having to work towards sort of sanctions before we're actually able to say properly that we give people credit. And we're trying hard to sort of give people credit for sharing data, for registering. So we're trying to sort of feed back our audit to researchers, to grantees, so they know that they're doing well in terms of registration. But I think credit is something that we really must work a bit harder about, I think.
Yeah, I agree. And one of the things that I said in my presentation was about aligning expectations, but part of that is this bringing together of the different stakeholders that have an interest in this area. And if we can bring the funders and the publishers and the regulators together to start talking about what are the expectations together, but also thinking about those kind of credits that we can potentially look at together, sharing the data, I think that'll be a really powerful way of, you know, sort of really galvanizing people to do the right thing.
I think we should highlight the fact that medical journal publishers are a very, very important stakeholder group. They were the first one who said that publication of study protocols is mandatory. They were the first that said, of those prestigious journals, that a strategy or a policy needs to be in place of data sharing. And if not, papers get not published. So if those powerful medical journal editors join forces, they can make the difference.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Hi, I have a question. So I'm Sarai from University's Allied for Essential Medicines. So basically I'm part of a student organization that has been working a lot on holding our institutions accountable for clinical trial transparency, like from a student body perspective. And I was just wondering if the speakers had any further advice on how we could do that most fruitfully and what the role of the student body could be therein.
I think it's actually very important within institutions that research organisations do understand that this is their responsibility. So I think something that students are able to do is actually make it an issue within the university. So we have a thing called a research excellence framework in the UK, where there's a sort of an evaluation of universities and their research outputs sort of every sort of 4 or 5 years. We've tried to get things such as clinical trials transparency into those, but it doesn't really fit with that system. So there isn't a good way, apart from things like the trials trackers, of actually highlighting where institutions are not working hard. So I think it's really important actually that students are actually standing up and saying, you know, because students are quite clearly part of an institution and can actually, you know, say this is something that our institution should be doing, something we'd be proud of our institution if they did. So I think that's where students really do play a role, because and getting those research that work in the institution that sort of have maybe been around for a long time and not always registered their trials to actually understand that this is something that is something they should be doing, something that's kind of morally they should be doing, to make sure that these studies are available as possible to everyone.
I'm really pleased to hear about the work that you're doing, because I think that's wonderful. And I think this is one way of really instituting culture change, because, you know, we have to make sure that everybody feels the responsibility to make transparency the norm. And, you know, if you can continue with your work and then potentially network with other institutions and other student groups, and I think, you know, sort of to really get a groundswell of voice, that would be really helpful.
I also think it's very good to have a bottom-up development here, because research allocation at our universities is also based on teaching, and student performance is part of teaching. So I think this is very important, your point raised. Thanks very much.
You know, one thing you might consider, TIL and TranspariMed regularly publish, you know, a summary of University of X has published this percentage. you could do that for your own institution. The data are publicly available on clinicaltrials.gov and University. It might take a little sifting, but at least you could sort of come up with a percentage and see how do we get that to 100.
Thanks so much for the suggestions. We're actually working on that, and we're also making a clinical trial tracker for the clinicaltrials.gov website, and it's about to be launched in a few weeks, where we're specifically looking at UK universities, and we're also like looking at their policies and comparing those, and we're working together with Till on that. So luckily we have a good mentor there, but I'm very grateful for your advice. Thank you.
Oh, that's great.
From the personal experience, when I talk to people about trial transparency, I think the most emotional response has been from patients, because they, let's say, unfortunately, uninformed community, when they find out that trials are unreported, that hurts them the most and their carers. And I was wondering if you're aware of any work which is done through patient organizations or patient engagement, where their voices can lead this way forward, because I think it's amazing what you do, for example, through student organizations, but I think there's another very, very powerful way forward of engaging patients to increase transparency.
I think most of the funding bodies now ask for explicitly, when you apply for grant, for user committees, and they need to have patient representation. And the same system was also applied in the Innovative Medicines Initiative funded by the EU, together with co-funding, most in kind by the pharmaceutical industry. So this is a model already which I think can be applied also to different parts. But as regards universities, we don't have this public stakeholder view in a sort of group at a structural level embedded yet.
Can I ask either Rachel or one of the other speakers, how much work is it for institutions and other sort of universities to actually not only put all the information in the registries, but to sort of update their sort of numbers on the reporting and that kind of thing? Because I suppose if it was quite resource heavy, I could see why maybe some of the, or you know, sadly some of the research then or you know, trials don't actually properly get registered or reported. And is that something that's reflected in the funding? In other words, is there some resource set aside as part of the funding with the idea that actually the funders can help collaborate with maybe with some of these organisations to help with either the administrative burden or not? I don't know enough about it. I just want to get your views on that.
So I would say that I don't think the administrative burden of actually registering is very great. There's obviously a fee for registering with the ISRCTN registry, but that's something that we as a funders pay. And the things that I think, for example, are more burdensome are things like curating or preparing a data set to share. But again, if someone who wants funding comes to us and they sort of have set aside a certain amount of money that they ask for that would be required to prepare the data set, then that's certainly we would consider as part of the funding. Most people don't actually put that in as part of their application, but it would be a reasonable thing to request in order to make a data set available. So so I think in that way, I don't think it's I mean, I have to say I have, because MRC is also a sponsor, I have looked at the UDRCT system, and actually posting results there can be quite problematic, particularly when it's for trials. But that may be partly because at the time those trials, they've been published in a way that the data didn't always fit into the way in which you have to post the results in the registry. The ISRCTN just provides a link to the published report, so the published paper. So actually it's really quite easy to add that in and update the entry. So again, that's one reason why we particularly push that registry, because we don't think it's burdensome for people to actually to complete that and to update it regularly.
Brilliant, thank you for that.
So thank you very much for everyone's participation, for very active discussion. We're out of time.